Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, whenever it is again that you are watching this lesson. No video today on account of I am recording this at my other job. So there is no video for a few of these, just based on when I've recorded them. So today we're going to be talking about narration and point of view, and we're going to be looking at Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart and Phil Kaye's poem Before the Internet. A lot of you have probably read The Telltale Heart already, or at least have heard of The Telltale Heart, so we don't need to go that much into kind of the background of that, because that is one of the most famous short stories in American literature. But we do need to kind of look at narration and point of view. So the narration, the point of view, these are both the sense of who is telling the story. See, fiction is always mediated by somebody else. Nonfiction, you have your expert telling you straight up what the facts are. For fiction, however, it always has to go through somebody else first. Think of it like a coffee filter. That person that is mediating fiction is called your narrator. These stories reveal distinctive angles of vision or perspective. Okay, that would be your point of view, right? The distinct angle from which we're seeing it, as we learned in our lesson on the introduction to the course, when I gave you the brief definition of point of view, it was, a sense of where we're seeing the story from. We have two distinctive kind of subsects of narration. The first is voice. This is the verbal quality of the narration. So what words is the narrator using? What tone is the narrator conveying? Are they conveying a comedic tone? Are they conveying a negative tone? Is it a serious tone? Is it educated? Is it not educated? What is the verbal quality of their narration? So if you were to listen to them rather than read the word, if you're listening to it, what is the quality of how it sounds? Does it sound like Morgan Freeman narrating it?
Get busy living or get busy dying. That's goddamn right.
Or does it sound like Jeff Dunham's puppet Bubba J narrating it?
I've been watching NASCAR and drinking beer.
Which one of those is closer? That's your voice. That's your voice of your narrator. The second part of what makes up narration is called the focus. This is the visual angle of narration. What is the visual style of the narration? Is this set as dialogue? Is the narration set as a diary entry? Are the sentences long and drawn out? Are they short? How does it look? Okay, are we being shown the whole picture? Are we being shown a portion of it? Point of view is both of these things put together. It's the voice and the focus amalgamated into one. Character is always your focal point. When it comes to point of view, it is always the point of view of a certain character, whether that character is the narrator or is somebody within the story itself. Your character is your focal point. Your character is where your point of view comes from. Point of view can shift in a story. You can start off with one person's point of view and then switch to somebody else's point of view, okay? So point of view can shift. It varies according to the narrator's position within the story, and that's where I draw your attention to this image here at the bottom. In the first panel of this little comic, the man that's stranded on the island is so excited to see a boat. Okay, so his point of view is that the boat is there to rescue him. In the second panel, the man who is stranded at sea sees salvation in the land. So his point of view is that he's being saved because he found an island. So So depending on who's telling the story, that's the same event happening, but depending upon who's telling the story depends on the point of view, depending upon where the narrator's position is within the story. And your narrator can also vary in grammatical person. You can have a first-person narrator, you can have a third-person narrator, okay? And we'll go into those in a little more detail in just a second. There's different types of narration. There's third-person narration. This is probably the most common. And there's first-person narration, which is probably the second most common. There's also second-person narration, which is very rare, but it does occur. This would be one of those choose-your-own-adventure books that we used to read when we were kids, or an instruction manual. Okay, something that's you are kind of the narrator, or you are the point of view. It is very rare, but it does happen. We need to talk for just a minute about narrator versus implied author. When you're talking about a narrator, it is never acceptable to simply replace the author's name with that of the narrator. This usually happens when there's a first-person narrator. Okay, now if there's a third-person narrator, then yes, you can say, for example, if Poe, we're reading a story on Poe, written by Poe, and there's a third-person narrator, you can say Poe said, this, that, and the third, and he meant this, this, and this. But when it's a first-person narration, it is not the author, okay? It is this implied narrator. The narrator is a separate character. It's not the author. So you wouldn't quote the author as saying the words so much as you would quote the narrator or the character. It would be just as if you were writing about another character speaking. It's a little difficult to kind of understand, but know that the author and the first-person narrator are not the same person, unless we're talking about, an autobiography. In fiction, the narrator and the author are not ever the same person, unless explicitly stated. We also have what's called an unreliable narrator. As the name implies, this is a narrator who we can't trust to give us 100% completely accurate information. A lot of times this will fall into the first-person narrator. Why? Well, I'll get into that a little more in a second, but just think about why a first-person narrator. So a first-person narrator would use I, right? So I sat down at my computer and I typed in this into the search bar and blah, 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 blah. Think about when a kid gets in trouble and they're trying to tell you what happened. Okay, that would be kind of an unreliable narrator. You're not really 100% sure what they're saying is accurate. Point of view also encompasses general matters of value. Okay, the character's value, the author's values, their moral center. So we can see a shift in kind of that moral value, that code of conduct, dependent upon whose point of view we're looking at the story from. With an omniscient narrator, this is also a third-person narrator. It's a disembodied, unidentified voice. They know more exposition than a first-person narrator, so they're going to give you more backstory. Okay, think of them as the voice of God, right? The kind of overlord. They're not part of the story. They can enter any character's mind. So immediately when you're reading, if you see somebody, if you see your narration say, I must go to the movies on Thursday, James thought because we're entering the character's mind and we're being told what they're thinking. That's your clue that you have an omniscient narrator. Omniscient is, meaning all-knowing or all-seeing. And then we have an in-character narrator. This is going to be your first-person narrator. They don't offer insight into other characters' thoughts. Okay, think of your Holden Caulfield's from Catcher in the Rye, right? We only see things from his perspective, his point of view. We only see what's going on in his head. We don't see what's going on in anybody else's head. So you have that. they may push their own agenda, which is what makes them more of an unreliable narrator. Because we are only getting the information that they want us to have, or to look at it in a more kind of positive way, we're only given the information that they have, that they themselves have. If they don't have all sides to the story, they can't give us all sides to the story, which inherently makes them unreliable. Think about what we know about eyewitnesses to crimes. Eyewitness testimony, eyewitness identifications are not the only thing anymore that would cause somebody to, be convicted of a crime, because eyewitness memory is unreliable. Okay, that's why you call multiple witnesses in a trial. You don't rely on the testimony of one person. So style and tone also fit into narration, as does irony. I'll go over irony in a second, but style and tone, your narrator and your POV are what are going to determine how the story is read and how it is perceived. If a story is intended to be comedic, your style and your tone, the narrator's style and tone, have to match that energy. They have to be comedic in themselves. You cannot have a serious narrator in a comedic story. You can have serious characters in a comedic story, but your narrator is the one that's going to kind of push that idea of what the style and tone is. So if it's supposed to be taken seriously, your narrator's not going to be cracking jokes. Okay? If it's supposed to be, fun and light and free, your narrator's not going to be putting in all these depressing details. So keep that in mind as well. And then we have irony. So irony is discrepancies or gaps between vision and voice, so what we see and what we hear, intentions and understandings, so what an author means to say versus how we perceive it, and then expectations and outcomes, so what we think is going to happen versus what ultimately happens. Irony is not coincidence. Okay, so something's not ironic just because it coincidentally happens to be. If you look down here in the corner, you'll see that is a picture of Alanis Morissette with a line from one of her most famous songs called Ironic. I'm going to show you some of the words to that, but keep in mind what I just said about irony and coincidence. So these are some of the words to her song Ironic. An old man turned 98, won the lottery, and died the next day. A black fly in your Chardonnay. Chardonnay is wine, for those of you that don't know. A death row pardon 2 minutes too late. Rain on your wedding day. A free ride when you've already paid. Good advice that you didn't take. Guy who plays it safe his entire life and is afraid to fly. Packs his suitcase. Gets on the plane and the plane crashes. Traffic jam when you're already late. A no smoking sign on your cigarette break. 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife. Now these aren't ironic circumstances. These are coincidences. These are just bad luck. Okay, these are just wrong place at the wrong time. Now, with a song title called Ironic, we would kind of expect things in the story to be ironic. So it's interesting that none of these things are ironic. Playing back into expectations and outcomes, okay? We expect a song entitled Ironic to have ironic situations in it, only to find out that none of the situations she's talking about are ironic. The song is ironic. The fact that the title of the song plays with our expectations of what it means to be ironic, the title of the song plays to our expectations of what we think it should be, in and of itself is ironic. It's actually a genius concept. So that's narration and point of view. These lessons are going to be quick because I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. Now let's get into Edgar Allan Poe. As you can see there, he was 40 years old when he died. He had a humongous head. That is what a lot of people know him for. He is one of the greatest American author poets to have ever lived. He is on what I like to call the Mount Rushmore of American short story writers in terms of early American, so let's say, 18th, 19th century American authors that really put forward this idea of the true American short story, what it means to be an American short story. Those four men would, unfortunately, they're all men, sorry, but those four men are Washington Irving, who you may know as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, The Devil and Tom Walker, amongst others. He would have been the first. Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, among countless short stories. And Edgar Allan Poe, who would have been contemporaries, okay? And then Ambrose Bierce. Bierce comes along a little bit later, during and after the Civil War. And these last three gentlemen we're going to read stories from. So Hawthorne, Poe, and Bierce we're going to read throughout the semester. Irving, not so much, because his short stories are still kind of long form. So we're not going to be reading him. But those are the four that I would say are the American short story Mount Rushmore. Okay, they are the ones that wrote these short stories that gave him an American identity to the genre of short story. So Poe is an American writer, poet, editor, and critic. He's the central figure of Romanticism and American literature. When we say Romanticism, we don't mean romance, we mean Romanticism. So the Romantic movement, or the Romantic era, Romanticism, is a movement that originated in Europe at the end of the 18th century, hit its peak around 1800 to 1850. Its emphasis is on emotion and individualism, nature, and how idealistic nature can be, science and industry, and the kind of suspicious nature that people had towards it, and glorification of the past. Okay, it looked to medieval times rather than classical times, so kind of that in between. It was partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and to the Age of Enlightenment and science. Okay, the kind of upswing of science that was going on at the time. So this was in a response to that. So this is kind of a getting back to nature. Okay, getting back in touch with those kind of things. And he was central to that. He's one of the early practitioners of the short story. As I had said, he's one of the ones that kind of brought this idea of the American short story to prominence. He's the inventor of detective fiction. He has a detective named Inspector Dauphin. He appears in 3 of his stories, the most famous being The Murders at the Rue Morgue, which was written in 1841. Now, a lot of people, when they think of detective fiction, and the earliest forms of detective fiction, they think of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was not written until 1887. So Dauphin came first, and Inspector Dauphin is the prototype for Sherlock Holmes. Doyle was inspired by Dauphin. They're pretty much the same character, just from different sides of the pond. All right, Doyle was from England, so Sherlock Holmes would have been the British equivalent of Inspector Dauphin, who is French but written by an American author. So Poe came up with that idea first. He created that first. He's also very prominent in the emergence of sci-fi. Not sci-fi as we know it with, laser blasters and spaceships and aliens and those things, but kind of stories that kind of have this fantastical or kind of science-based element to them. He's the first well-known American to earn a living entirely through his writing. When he wasn't selling short stories or poems, he was editing. He was a literary critic. He was not a very well-liked literary critic. But he didn't care. He was content with being He was content with people thinking that he was kind of an a-hole. He didn't care as long as he got paid. There is an interesting story about him and Hawthorne. He didn't like Hawthorne at all. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was notorious for publishing his stories under pseudonyms, so under, pen names, not under his own. And Poe was also notorious for, if a story came across his desk written by somebody he didn't like, he wouldn't read it. He would crumble it up, throw it in the waste bin, and write a scathing review on it without ever having read it. So Hawthorne has this new story that comes across Poe's desk, and in order for him to, in order for the newspaper to actually get his honest opinion on it, they put a pen name on it. Now, it was Hawthorne submitting it as himself, but they put a pen name on it, and they didn't tell Poe who it was, and he praised it as, being from the creative intellect of a true genius, and the equivalent of 10 stars and 4 thumbs up and whatever the case may be. And then afterwards they told Poe, after the review had printed, they told Poe, Hawthorne wrote that. And Poe supposedly looked at his editor and he said, well, we are all human. Nobody is perfect. Each man is allowed at one mistake in his lifetime, and I have used mine now. Even being that he earned his living entirely through his writing, he still had a financially difficult life and career. The reason for that was because he was a huge alcoholic, and he was addicted to opium. So every time money came in, it would go right out. This worsened upon the death of his wife. Poe was surrounded by death. Speaking of the death of his wife, his birth mother died. His birth father left when he was about 2 or 3 years old. One of those situations where, dad goes out for milk and doesn't come back. The old cliche. Well, in Poe's case, it kind of was. Dad left. He just walked out. He was adopted by the Allens, hence his middle name. Unofficially adopted. There was never paperwork signed or anything like that, but he became a part of the family, took on the middle name of Allen as kind of a way to honor them. His adopted mother died. His adopted father, John Allen, died, which hit him hard, even though the two of them didn't really get along. And his wife died relatively young. So he's surrounded by death. So if you ever wondered why he writes these macabre stories and these kind of dark and depressing poems, it's because the man was dealing with a lot. Okay, he was dealing with a lot. His wife, by the way, was his 13-year-old cousin Virginia Clem, whom he married when he was 26. But he did love her. He was heartbroken when she died. She passed away of tuberculosis. He was absolutely heartbroken when she died, and his writing reflects that. So you'll start to see kind of, and like I said, after she died, his opioid use and his alcoholism skyrocketed. So he kind of went into this spiral. One of the most interesting things about Poe is his death. He was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore on October 3rd, 1849. He was seen as being in great distress and in need of immediate assistance. This is from Joseph Walker, the man who found him. Supposedly, he was wearing clothes that were not his own. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days or eaten in days. He was hardly recognizable. But I mean, they still knew it was Poe. Like it was the Clark Kent Superman where you put the glasses on and then you don't realize it's Superman. That kind of unrecognizable. He died 4 days later at 5 o'clock in the morning. He was never coherent long enough to explain how he came to be in the condition that he was in. He was slipping in and out of consciousness and kind of just shouting out words, and he repeatedly called out the name Reynolds on the night before his death, but investigators and police could not find anybody around that matched the name Reynolds, so they don't know who that was or who he was looking for. His last words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." And then he slipped into a coma and then eventually passed away. His medical records were completely lost, including his death certificate. So his actual cause of death is unknown. A few years after his death, those records were lost. Or just, many people believe they were destroyed, which of course leads conspiracy theorists all up and down the walls, right? That is an actual picture of Poe in his casket. I included it here just because I am creepy. His death was recorded as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation. This was commonly used on death certificates for death from just disreputable causes, syphilis or overdose, or anything that would have kind of had a negative connotation to it that would have, the quote unquote that the family would have wanted to cover up. Alcoholism and drugs were a big one. But like I said, his actual cause of death remains a mystery even today. Several speculated causes are listed here. Some of my favorites are rabies, tuberculosis, meningeal inflammation, epilepsy, overdose is a big one. There was a group of medical students and scientists that I believe it was in the 1970s actually exhumed his body to try to figure out how he died. And they found a small, it looked like a ball bearing in his skull. That may have been a tumor, so he may have had some kind of brain cancer, some kind of tumor in the brain. But a lot of people say that it was, the drugs and the alcohol. Early theory suggests cooping was the cause. So what cooping was election fraud. People were forced to vote for a particular candidate. They'd go from poll location to poll location, change their clothes, change their hair, change the way they looked, give a different name, and vote multiple times. 1849 in Baltimore was an election year. The only reason that a lot of people dispute this is because Poe was well known. People knew who he was. Like I said, he was almost unrecognizable when they found him on October 3rd, but he wasn't completely unrecognizable. Sometimes cooping would lead to violence or murder. People would be killed for it. People would be bribed. People would be threatened. And it's entirely possible that if he was the victim of cooping, that they, knowing who Poe was, that all the people who were trying to force him into this election fraud, all they had to do would be to offer him alcohol or drugs, and he probably would have gone along with it. So the Telltale Heart itself, a little bit of the background information, published in The Pioneer, which was a magazine, in January 1843. Classic Gothic fiction, okay? The dark, the macabre, the mysterious, the looking deep into the nature of man. Specific motivation for the murder, the relationship between the narrator and the old man, and the gender of the narrator are left unclear, and these were intentional. Poe wanted the narrator to be like all of us, and wanted it to be so that we could all, whoever was reading the story could relate to the narrator. So not giving the narrator specifics, leaving some of these things up to the imagination, helps us to kind of put ourselves in the narrator's shoes. Do we necessarily want to? No. But Poe, I believe, is trying to show us that anybody can go mad given the right motivation. You don't need to know what it is because it's going to be different for you than it is for anybody else. And I think it's interesting, too, this idea that the gender of the narrator is never revealed. Now, we always generally assume that the narrator is a man, but it doesn't have to be. There's nothing in the story that indicates that it can't be a woman. So think about that and go back and reread The Telltale Heart and see if it changes your perception of the story based on what gender you attribute the main to the main character. The narrator denies having any feelings of hatred or resentment for the old man. So this leads to speculation that the old man is some kind of a father figure, or the landlord, or that the narrator is this old man's employee. Okay? There's no ill will. It's not like the narrator just kind of runs in and, straight whacks this guy. It's not something that's been, it's been planned, but it hasn't been planned out, due to anything negative that the old man does to the narrator. It's this vulture eye. And the vulture eye represents this kind of veiled secret or this power that the old man has over our narrator. Poe was likely paid about $10 for the story, so obviously not an incredible amount of money. That would be, adjusting for inflation, about $272 in 2019. So again, it's a lot. That's a lot for a short story. Most people that publish short stories today probably only get about $50. If you're lucky, you get $272 if you're lucky. So the fact that he was given $10 for the story worked out pretty well for him in the long run. Originally published with an epigraph which quoted Longfellow. When Poe republished it in 1845 in the Broadway Journal, he removed the epigraph from Longfellow because he called, and again I'm paraphrasing but quoting Poe, he called Longfellow a plagiarizing bastard. Again, Poe didn't like many people and didn't care to know who knew it. This one was reprinted several times during his lifetime because it was so short. It was easy to reprint. People loved to see it, and he could make some quick cash with it, which was always good for him because he was addicted to opium and alcohol, and he needed the money for it. So what are the themes of The Telltale Heart? Real quick. Guilt, madness, reality versus perception, mortality, time, sanity versus insanity. These ideas, these themes are going to come up more than once throughout the course of the semester, especially this idea of reality versus perception. What is real versus what we perceive to be real. Moving on. Now, for these poets, we're kind of just going to get a little biographical information because really I want you all to kind of interpret the poems in your own way, so I don't want to skew it for you too much. So the poem that we're looking at in terms of narration and point of view, mostly focusing on point of view, is by Phil K. There he is right there. Gorgeous head of hair. And incidentally, Phil and I are the same age. So there's that. I'm slightly older than Phil. Phil K. is a Japanese-American poet, writer, and director. He's the co-director of Project Voice, which is a poetry collective. He was born in California, raised out in California. Until he was 5 years old, he spoke entirely Japanese. His mother is Japanese, a Japanese immigrant. His father is Jewish descent. So he is, and I bring that up because his heritage, his background, the Japanese and the Jewish background, are very important to Phil, and he brings them up a lot in his poetry. So as we go through, we're going to have a few of his poems throughout the course of the semester. And as we go through, you're going to see kind of these ideas, these recurring kind of motifs of the Japanese and Jewish kind of heritages and backgrounds. Some of the things that he recalls of when he's talking about his grandparents, and how that kind of interplays with his life. And on the surface, it might seem kind of, just surface level, but in reality, it goes much deeper than that. He began performing at the age of 17, so there's that. He attended Brown University, which is a very prestigious university. Made the National Poetry Slam Finals in 2011, which would have been right around the time that he was finishing up Brown, right after he graduated from Brown. He's a former teacher of poetry workshops in maximum security prisons, which led to him becoming the head coordinator of something called Space in Prisons for the Arts and Creative Expression, or simply SPACE. He opened for the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday celebration in 2017. That just shows you how popular Phil is, and how important people feel his poetry is. He opened for the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday. And he's performed in 20 different countries. So he is a world-traveled, world-renowned poet. Again, bearing in mind that his poetry, especially the one that you're going to read for this section, deals a lot with his background and his history and who he is and who makes, what makes us the people we are today. His book, Date and Time, which is where all of the poems from him that we're going to be looking at this semester, all of them come from Date and Time. It deals with this idea of the past and the future influencing the present. The past, present, and the future all having kind of this influence on each other. So think about that. Give the poem a read. Give the story a reread again. And complete the quiz on the Telltale Heart and the essay on Before the Internet. And once those are completed and turned in, you may move on to Lesson 3. Remember to be good people.